It rarely looks like cruelty from the inside. That is the first thing worth noticing about it. Someone sends a message they know will land badly and then puts the phone down and makes a cup of tea. Someone makes a decision in a meeting that will quietly devastate the person it concerns and then moves on to the next item on the agenda. Someone says something in front of others that they know will humiliate, not loudly, not dramatically, just precisely enough to land where it was aimed, and then continues the conversation as though nothing particular has happened. The person doing it is not cackling, they are not consumed by malice. They are just getting on with their day. And that is what makes cruelty so difficult to see clearly, in yourself or in others. Because it almost never arrives wearing the face you expect it to wear. Distance is what makes it possible, not always physical distance. Sometimes it is the distance of a screen, the message sent without having to watch it arrive. Sometimes it is the distance of a role, a manager, an authority, a person whose position creates enough separation that the human on the other side of the decision becomes an abstraction. Sometimes it is the distance of a group, where the responsibility for what is happening is spread thin enough across enough people that no single person has to feel the full weight of it. The cruelty happens, but the person who delivered it doesn't quite experience themselves as the one who did it. And sometimes the distance is emotional. The quiet withdrawal of warmth from someone who depends on it, the deliberate absence of acknowledgement from someone who knows their acknowledgement matters. The cold, measured response designed to communicate something that would be too exposing to say directly. These things are felt acutely by the person on the receiving end. But the person delivering them can almost always find a way to explain that what they are doing doesn't require them to use the word cruelty. This is what makes it one of the most quietly common experiences in ordinary human life. It doesn't require exceptional malice, it doesn't require a particular kind of person. It only requires enough distance, physical, emotional, social, or institutional, to make the other person feel slightly less real. And that kind of distance is available to almost everyone, almost every day, without them ever having to notice they are using it. Carl Jung would not begin by asking you what the other person deserved. He would begin by asking you what cruelty does to the person delivering it, and what it says about the parts of themselves they have not yet been willing to look at. Because cruelty, in most cases, doesn't feel like cruelty from the inside. It feels like control, like protection. Like the reasonable response to a situation that required a firm hand or a cold decision or a precise and deliberate withdrawal of warmth. The person on the receiving end feels something very different. But the person delivering it has almost always found a way to experience it as something other than what it is. Jung would ask you to sit with that gap between what was done and how it was understood by the one who did it. Jung called the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge the shadow. And cruelty, he observed, is one of the places the shadow operates most freely. Because the distance that makes cruelty possible, the screen, the role, the emotional withdrawal, also makes it easier for the shadow to act without being seen. When you don't have to watch the other person absorb what you just delivered, you don't have to feel it either. The shadow moves in the space that distance creates. And it can do considerable damage there without ever being brought into the light. What Carl Jung would want you to look at honestly is the satisfaction that sometimes accompanies cruelty. Not always, but often enough to be worth examining. The quiet sense of power that comes from delivering a precise and well-aimed response. The feeling of control that arrives when you withdraw something someone needs. These feelings are uncomfortable to acknowledge. But Jung was consistent on this point. The things we are most reluctant to look at in ourselves are almost always the things most worth examining. Because what we refuse to see doesn't disappear, it simply finds other ways to act. Cruelty, in Jung's understanding, is often the shadow's most available tool. Not because the person is fundamentally cruel, but because distance made it easy, and nobody, including the person themselves, was watching closely enough to notice what was actually happening. Friedrich Nietzsche understood something about cruelty that is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. That it is not always the behavior of people who feel powerful. Very often, he observed, it is the behavior of people who don't. And the story that forms around it is almost always one that makes the cruelty disappear entirely, replaced by something that sounds considerably more reasonable. The manager who humiliates someone in a meeting is not being cruel, they are maintaining standards. The person who withdraws warmth deliberately and precisely is not being cruel, they are protecting themselves. The one who sends the message they know will land badly is not being cruel, they are simply being honest. Nietzsche watched these reframings with the same cool precision he applied to everything else. The story, he noticed, always arrives quickly. Before the dust has settled, before the person on the receiving end has had time to fully absorb what just happened. What Nietzsche would ask you to notice is the relationship between cruelty and power. Not power in the obvious sense, not the powerful person crushing someone beneath them, but the quieter kind. The cruelty that emerges when someone feels that their position, their dignity, or their sense of control is under threat. When the story they tell about themselves is being challenged by someone else's presence or behavior or simple existence. In those moments, cruelty becomes a way of restoring something. Of reasserting a version of the self that the situation seemed to be undermining. And the story that follows is always tailored precisely to that need. It doesn't frame what happened as an act of cruelty driven by insecurity or wounded pride, it frames it as strength, as clarity. As the willingness to do what others were too soft or too sentimental to do. Nietzsche had a word for this kind of self-deception, the way the will to power, when it cannot express itself openly, finds disguised routes. Cruelty dressed as discipline, cruelty dressed as honesty, cruelty dressed as the simple and necessary maintenance of order. The story is always convincing from the inside. It has to be. Because the alternative, acknowledging that what you did was cruel, and that the distance you used made it easier, requires a kind of honesty that is genuinely difficult. It requires you to look at the gap between who you believe yourself to be and what you just did. And that gap, when it is wide enough, is one of the most uncomfortable things a person can be asked to stand in. Hannah Arendt spent a great deal of her life trying to understand something that deeply unsettled her. Not how monsters commit cruelty, but how ordinary people do. People with families and routines and perfectly normal lives outside of the moments in which they participated in something that caused serious harm to another human being. What she observed, and what stayed with her, was that the most disturbing cruelty is rarely the product of exceptional malice. It is the product of distance, structure, and the quiet normalization of behavior that nobody in the room is willing to name out loud. Arendt watched how institutions and hierarchies create the conditions for cruelty without anyone having to decide to be cruel. The decision gets broken into small enough pieces that no single person holds the whole of it. The person who makes the call doesn't deliver it, the person who delivers it doesn't see it land, the person who sees it land doesn't have the authority to question it. And at each stage, the distance is just wide enough that the human reality of what is happening stays slightly out of focus. Arendt called this the banality of evil, not because the cruelty is small, but because the people participating in it are so ordinary, so unremarkable, so convinced that they are simply doing what the situation requires. Niccolò Machiavelli approached cruelty from a completely different direction. He was not interested in its moral dimensions. He was interested in its mechanics. And what he observed is that cruelty, when used deliberately and strategically, is one of the most effective tools available inside a hierarchy. Not cruelty for its own sake, but cruelty deployed at the right moment, in the right measure, toward the right person, as a signal. A demonstration of what is possible, a reminder of where the power actually sits. Machiavelli was honest about something that most people prefer not to acknowledge. That cruelty works. That it produces compliance, and silence, and a particular kind of order that is very difficult to disturb once it has been established. What Arendt and Machiavelli together point toward is something worth sitting. Cruelty does not require a cruel person. It requires the right conditions, enough distance, enough structure, enough diffusion of responsibility that nobody has to fully own what is happening. Those conditions are not rare or exceptional. They exist in workplaces, in families, in groups of people who would all describe themselves as decent. The question worth carrying is not whether you have ever been on the receiving end of that kind of cruelty. Most people have. The question is whether you have ever been inside the conditions that made it possible, and whether you noticed it at the time.